Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate.
We believe that there's an option for every student.
We are there to help students and serve them. It's our mission.
And education is transformational. It changes lives.
Hi, my name is Tori Lysick, and I am a political science and journalism major at CU. The panel you're about to watch is called Fighting Falsehoods with Facts, The Challenges of Objective Journalism. It is about how objectivity is difficult even for the most experienced journalists. Panelists will also discuss how propaganda doesn't always play the same journalistic ethics. Feel free to ask the panelists questions and enjoy!
Hi, everybody. Welcome and thank you for logging on to the CU Boulder Conference on World Affairs virtual panel, Fighting Falsehoods with Facts, Challenges of Objective Journalism. For those of you who want to submit questions, you can do so at any time during the session through the YouTube chat. When you submit a question, please let us know if you're a CU student and, if you don't mind, sharing the location where you're logging in from. Also, I wanted to let you know that all of the CWA panels are being recorded on YouTube and will be available to watch immediately after each event on the CWA YouTube channel. So I'm grateful today to have with us three highly accomplished journalists to tackle the topics that we're going to talk about. Dan Balz is the chief correspondent at the Washington Post. He joined the Post in 1978 and has been involved in political coverage as a reporter or an editor throughout his career. Before joining the Post, he worked at the National Journal magazine as a reporter and an editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer. He's the author of several books, including 2 bestsellers. He was born in Freeport, Illinois, graduated from the University of Illinois, and served in the U.S. Army. He's a regular panelist on PBS's Washington Week and a frequent guest on Sunday morning news talk shows and other kinds of public affairs programs. So welcome, Dan. Ana Cabrera anchors the weekend primetime edition of CNN Newsroom, which is based in New York. She has reported on stories ranging from the COVID-19 pandemic and politics to natural disasters and mass shootings. Her political coverage includes reporting and analysis of the 2020 presidential election, the attack on the U.S. Capitol in January, President Donald Trump's historic 2 impeachment proceedings. She also hosted multiple Democratic presidential candidate town halls in 2020, and she provides in-depth coverage of the Me Too movement and of immigration issues. She joined CNN as a correspondent in 2013, based in Denver, and prior to joining CNN, she was an anchor for Denver's daily morning news program on 7 News. In 2019, she was awarded with the National Hispanic Media Coalition Impact Award. She's a graduate of the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University, where she's a member of the Murrow Professional Advisory Board. And in 2019, she was honored as an inductee into the Murrow Hall of Achievement. So welcome, Anna. David French is an American political commentator and a former attorney. He's a senior editor at The Dispatch and a columnist for Time magazine. He's also the author or co-author of several books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, Rise of ISIS, A Threat We Can't Ignore. His most recent book is Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, past president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, a former lecturer at Cornell Law School. He's also served as a senior counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice and the Alliance Defending Freedom. He's a former major in the U.S. Army Reserve. In 2007, he deployed to Iraq and served as a squadron judge advocate for the 2nd Squadron, 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and he was awarded the Bronze Star for that work. So thank you, David, for joining us as well. We're going to let each of our panelists do a little bit of presentation, and we're going to do that in alphabetical order. So Dan, you're up.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this forum. I'm grateful to be with such other distinguished journalists. Before I begin, I want to extend my condolences to the families and friends of the victims of the recent shooting in Boulder. Colorado's obviously had too many of these shootings over so many years, and each of them has brought grief and sorrow, not just to the community, but to the country as a whole. And so I wanted to say that at the top. Now on to the topic of the day, fighting falsehoods with facts, the challenges of objective journalism. This is obviously a vitally important topic. I would like to break my presentation into two parts and split that title in half. Let me start with the fighting falsehoods with facts. As we know, falsehoods are rampant in our political debates, but not that they haven't existed in the past. Politicians, like all people, have told lies as long as there have been politicians and as long as there have been people. Lyndon Johnson's Gulf of Tonkin resolution, for example, which led to a major escalation of the Vietnam War, was built on a lie. Spinning by political operatives is endemic to politics and often prized by its practitioners. But I think there is something more pernicious today about the falsehoods that can permeate our public debate, that have permeated our public debate. A world in which there is acceptance of what Kellyanne Conway famously called alternative facts serves to undermine democracy itself, and therefore is something to be confronted and combated by a free press. It was the late Daniel Patrick Moynihan who once said, and this has been repeated for many years, that we are all entitled to our own opinions, but not to our own facts. And if only that were true today, which it is not. We've been living for some years now in a world in which falsehoods are peddled as truth. Conspiracy theories rattle around the internet, take root among parts of the population, and then become accepted in the face of evidence to the contrary. We saw the destructive impact of those kinds of falsehoods or lies in the post-election period, particularly, as the former president and his allies said repeatedly, without evidence, that the election had been rigged and stolen. We saw what ultimately happened with this, an attack on the Capitol of the United States. This is the most extreme example of what this kind of peddling of falsehoods and lies can do, but there are many, many others. I think when I look at it from the perspective of journalism, I think the role of traditional media has always been to fight falsehoods with facts. But this is harder. It has gotten harder in polarized political climate. Still, I think it remains a principal mission of a free press, regardless of the obstacles that exist. And I think that will always be the case. Our former editor, Marty Barron, famously said after the Trump administration had labeled the press enemies of the people, we are not at war, we are at work. And we continue to do that work. And so I think that is a fundamental mission that we take as a serious part of our responsibilities under the First Amendment. The second half of the title of today's forum is the challenges of objective journalism. And on this, I think the challenges of and to objective journalism are real, and I would suggest sometimes misunderstood. It's also the case that objectivity is often in the eye of the beholder. And again, in a polarized political and media climate, that heightens the debate about the role of the press and what constitutes objectivity and whether there can or should be objectivity. I would say that objective journalism does not demand neutrality or require giving equal weight to different points of view when the weight of evidence is far heavier in one particular direction. Nor is it or should it be a version of he said, or she said, or he said, she said storytelling. That is not what I think the goal ought to be. Walter Lippmann, more than a century ago, was the originator of the concept of objective journalism. And by this, he meant that all of us come to our work with preconceived notions based largely on the circumstances of our own lives and our own upbringings and our own experiences. And to the extent possible, he said, we should try to set aside those preconceived notions of the way the world is instead and pursue truth with an open mind. He said we ought to be willing to listen. We ought to be willing to consider competing views on issues and ideas. We ought to be willing to take those seriously. And above all, we should try to be fair and honest in how we report and what we write. But in a fraught political time, as we are in, even that has become more challenging. The press is more politicized today than it was 2 decades ago. Readers are not particularly forgiving if they feel the press is being too soft on the other side and too hard on their side. Some reporters are more inclined than others toward advocacy or opinion rather than traditional news and analysis. And social media often encourages this and definitely has exacerbated the problem. Additionally, there are generational differences that are rising in newsrooms all around the country about the role of reporters and the value of what they would regard as a kind of a neutered objectivity. So altogether, I think this means that there is less agreement today on what constitutes objective journalism or whether objective journalism should be the measure of good journalism. I believe that this is an expected outgrowth of the times we're living in. And I suspect we can have a very good discussion about this in the rest of the hour, and I will turn it back to Liz.
Great, thank you. And I'm just going to turn it over to Anna.
First of all, I just want to say thanks again for being here and for allowing me to participate in this discussion. I too share in the sorrow that Dan expressed about what happened in Boulder. Colorado is home for me. I grew up in Denver. My parents live in Longmont currently. I have a brother and sister-in-law in Erie. And so my heart sunk when we learned of the events there, and it continues to feel heavy knowing that your community is still grieving and that shooting has touched so many lives. I'm really grateful to be a part of this discussion and to look at the relevance of journalism today. And I think it has become more and more challenging in the last 4 or 5 years because of the hyperpartisanship and the divisive nature of our society right now. But I think it's also a proof of why the work we do is so important. And I think it's less of a challenge right now to be objective and more of a challenge of being perceived as objective, because we know trust in the media has continued to decline, particularly among Republicans. And perhaps it is because of the fake news mantra of the last administration. Perhaps it's because of all these different information avenues that are out there in which people have access to finding information that may suit their beliefs and then sticking in those echo chambers and not really looking for what is truth, what is fact, and vetting the information that they're receiving. But the bottom line is that distrust in mainstream media exists. And so the challenge is, how do you break through as a journalist that is focused on doing what a traditional journalist does? And what is that? What is that mission or that agenda? To me, it's all about public service. And it's really, that's the reason I got into this industry, was to serve the public, to be a government watchdog, to hold people in power accountable, because we're privileged to have access to those people. And so we have to ask the questions on behalf of the public and the audience. It's to educate, it's to inform. There's obviously a public safety component to all of it. It's to, shed light on disheartening realities and to uncover what those disheartening realities are. It's to give voice to the oppressed and the marginalized and the vulnerable in our society and to share their stories. And I think most importantly, it is to have a relentless pursuit of the truth and finding facts and leading reporting with those facts. And I think, in order to do that, there are a number of things that I always kind of go through in terms of the checklist. It's, we may bring people in power on my show, but it's not just allowing them to make claims, or it's not just believing assertions. It's challenging those assertions. It's demanding evidence. It's seeking evidence by myself, doing my research before, after, and throughout every day and every story that I am presenting. and making sure that we are, seeking out what is truth and what is fact and what is going to bring perspective and context to the story and the conversation, and our viewers' understanding of whatever the issue or story is that we're discussing or presenting. And I think in order to establish that credibility with your viewers, you have to have a reputation of being truthful and factual. And that part is being transparent with them. It's holding ourselves accountable. And I think one of the benefits of the very challenging past 4 years as a journalist has been that we are all scrutinized to the, highest levels. And I think we're scrutinizing ourselves and having to hold ourselves to the highest levels of accountability as well, because we know that people are quick to judge and they're quick to, find a mistake and then amplify those mistakes because it proves their point or their agenda. And so I think we've gotten even better about really dotting those I's and crossing those T's and thinking about why this story matters and what is the most relevant, important information and facts and truth to pursue in order to provide the best public service we can as a journalist to our viewers and our audiences. And so that is how I approach my job. And I think all of those factors come into play when it comes to breaking through with society and hoping to restore the trust with those people who may not be trustful right now of journalists.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that. David, your opening remarks.
Yeah, I really appreciate Dan and Anna's remarks, and I also absolutely share their condolences regarding the unbelievable tragedy in Boulder, which sadly has been replicated in many other communities, not just in 2021, but in years before. God bless the victims and family members. Okay, let's talk a minute about objectivity. I want to go with a different kind of term. Let's go with truth seeking, because what I think that has happened in some of our discussion is that objectivity has become sort of like a shorthand for saying what we should always do at all times is hear both sides, even if one side is transparently, obviously lying. And in that circumstance, what ends up happening is that the media becomes, in many ways, an avenue for the transmission of lies at scale. Let me give you an example where I think truth-seeking trumps sort of this notion, and I use objectivity, and I know that this is the word's kind of malleable, but I have heard this constantly when people say, for example, during the election contest, why didn't we hear more from Sidney Powell? Why didn't we hear more from some of the architects of the Stop the Steal, the big lie about the election? Why aren't you objective? Well, if I'm going to be, as a legal analyst, for example, if I'm going to be seeking the truth about the election, having Sidney Powell on my podcast, for example, is an impediment to that. She's an impediment to that. She's actively, consistently, and relentlessly lying. And so one of the things that I think is important in journalism is to pursue truth, shun lies. And as much as possible, now that's not to say you don't always have people from different sides who are making different good faith arguments. That's a very important part of journalism, is hearing from different sides who are making different good faith arguments. But one of the things that we began to see during much of the Trump term was you were having people who are engaging in bad faith arguments, who are engaging in outright obvious lying and gaslighting, and then demanding platforms in the name of objectivity to share and spread lies. And I think that's something where a good journalist often can have a gatekeeping function. So our desire here is to discern truth. Sometimes that means we're going to hear from different sides making good faith arguments that allow us to get to the truth. And sometimes that means that when we know that there's a bad faith argument that's flatly false, we're going to reject giving that a platform. So I think of it as if you have this view that says, my job is to be truth seeking. What that does is it begins to cut through a lot of the back and forth, got to hear from every single perspective sort of mindset that has sometimes begun to dominate American media platforms in a way that we saw was often quite harmful. And so I say, let's make a priority to say that what we're going to be doing is truth seeking. Number two, I also think that we need to distinguish between earned mistrust and manufactured mistrust. So those are two different things when it comes to the media. Earned mistrust is when a media outlet fails. It makes a mistake. It gets ahead of the facts. It releases a report that's wrong. This happens. People on both sides of the political aisle are able to point to examples of this happening off the top of their heads. Fox News, for example, shared the Seth Rich conspiracy theory and has been sued for defamation and has settled a defamation case as a result of that. The Seth Rich conspiracy theory being the idea that Seth Rich was behind some of the hacks of Democratic computers in 2016 rather than foreign operators. And so you can easily off the top of your head say, well, look at what Fox News did there. Or you can say, look at how some in the mainstream media raced way ahead of the facts when it came to the Covington Catholic controversy at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial a couple of years ago. Those are things are earned mistrust. In other words, there were failures there that led people to be more skeptical about the media. That's going to be inevitable to some degree because the media is comprised of human beings. Human beings make mistakes. One of our obligations when we make mistakes is to own up to them and describe transparently and with humility how they happen. I think that can build trust. But then we are also in the grips of a phenomenon where there is an enormous amount of manufactured mistrust. So let's say that there is a mistaken story in the Washington Post or in CNN or in Time or the Dispatch where I work. Let's say we make a mistake. We're human. We're going to make mistakes. What people will then do in a manufactured mistrust scenario is say that mistake defines you now and forever. That is who you are. That is who the New York Times is. That's who Time is. That's who Washington Post is. That's who CNN is. And what manufactured mistrust does is then try to blow up the scope of mistakes, to define entire media entities by their mistakes. And there's a huge market for that, so that you, in essence, inoculate your own political community against negative stories because you have created a background state of constant, permanent mistrust. And I think that is one of our serious problems. Yes, there is earned distrust. Yes, there have been mistakes. Yes, there has been bias. Surrounding that is a large industry of manufactured mistrust that exaggerates the scope of the mistakes, exaggerates the amount of bias, and exaggerates the sort of the perfidy and malice of media outlets that are perceived to be on opposing sides of the political aisle. And that's where we have a big problem.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that. I wanted to start by kind of probing a little bit more on this idea of objectivity, or David, as you call it, truth seeking. I think the objectivity word sometimes sets up unrealistic expectations. So, and Dan, you mentioned that objectivity doesn't necessarily require neutrality, which is, I think, what some people think of it as, right? Just being almost, he said, she said, automatronic, just stenographer news, if you will. But what does objectivity, kind of truth-seeking, require of journalism today, especially given the polarized political atmosphere that we're in? And is objectivity actually the best way to fully inform the public? Is there a role for advocacy journalism? I don't know if one of you wants to kind of jump in on that, or I can.
Some of the best journalism that I've read has come from outlets that have a point of view. So that have come from progressive or conservative outlets that have a point of view. And some of the best journalism I've read has actually been facilitated by the fact that they have a point of view, that means they understand a community very well. It means that they understand the background of the facts, the worldviews, the culture of the community that they're reporting on. And it's been incredibly, remarkably illuminating. The problem you have often when you have journalism with a point of view is when the point of view overwhelms the desire for truth. Because sometimes the desire for truth can undermine your own ideological tribe if you pursue it to its endpoint conclusion. And I think that that's one point where a lot of people have begun to see the media as putting on a red jersey and a blue jersey, and the media wearing the red jersey will never go in as deep as it needs to go to report on its own side, and vice versa. But I think some of the best journalism I've ever seen has come from people who have a point of view, but are committed to truth within that point of view.
I might just add on to that, because I think what you bring up is an interesting point. You know, I will have guests on my show who offer a partisan viewpoint when we're talking about policies or other issues that, you know, get into the political realm, whether it's immigration currently or, you know, the transportation infrastructure bill that is up for discussion and debate right now on Capitol Hill. And I think that it's important to provide different viewpoints on issues like that. I think when you talk about, you know, not being neutral, that not being the goal, Christiane Amanpour, one of my colleagues, has often used the example of climate change and the climate crisis. And when you have, you know, more than 97% of the scientific community saying this is real and this is happening and it is, you know, man-made, men have something to do with it, you're not going to put that consensus that's already exists out there as fact, essentially by the scientific expert community. You're not going to bring up a climate denier and put them in the same level or give them equal treatment. You may do what David suggests and shun one side, or you may offer the perspective that there are people who don't believe in it. And you might do that through talking to Joe Schmo down in Florida, who is impacted, but still is saying like he has nothing to do about it, or it's not going to impact him, so he's not going to worry about it. But then you are going to, you know, incorporate that in the story, which I think in some ways is important to acknowledge that there is that belief out there, which might build trust with some of those people who believe that, even if they are, you know, believing in something that is not worthy of their belief and their trust. It's convenient for them. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that, and it's important to present different viewpoints and opinions, but you don't necessarily give them equal treatment. And I think that's one way to sort of combat this idea of being objective and being neutral or having to always be balanced.
Liz, can I pick up on a couple of things that David said?
Yeah.
First, on the notion of truth seeking, I think that's a fundamentally important point. You know, when Eugene Meyer bought the Washington Post in 1933, he promulgated 7 principles for the conduct of a newspaper. The first one said the first mission of a newspaper is to tell the truth as nearly as the truth can be ascertained. And I think that's important for everybody to understand. It's the goal of what we do to find the truth, but we all recognize that we don't always get to the truth on the first day or the first hour of a story, and that our responsibility is to continue to try to pursue more facts and more reporting in order to get as close to the truth as we possibly can. I also agree that there's terrific journalism done by people on the left or the right, good reporters, solid reporters who dig deep. I think one of the things that sometimes is underappreciated is the role of a quote unquote independent press, which is, you could call it legacy media or traditional media or however you want to define it, but that there is a role for media organizations who do not identify in their news coverage with one side or the other, with one political party or another, with one particular point of view, but in their role are, in a sense, trying to do something of refereeing society, which is to say to call balls and strikes on both sides. I don't think there's been a president in the years that I've been at the Washington Post who has particularly enjoyed the coverage that he has gotten from the Washington Post or other major news organizations. It is the nature of what we do to have an adversarial relationship. And I think that over the last few years, that has blurred a bit because of the way, frankly, that President Trump conducted himself. And so I think that has become more of a issue that some people take as saying the press lacks objectivity. But I don't think that's the case. I think that the reality is the seeking of truth has created some confrontations that might not have existed in the past because of the level of the lies and falsehoods that we've had to deal with.
So one of the questions, and it kind of came up in the chat as well, but you've all mentioned this in various ways, this idea of calling balls and strikes, fact checking, verifying information. And I think that, yes, that's an important function, but it plays out differently in print, where you've got maybe a little more time than when you're on air, Anna or David, on a podcast, and somebody is saying something that you know to be a falsehood. Do you challenge it right away? And how do you challenge it? Because we've seen those interviews where people have just ended up butting heads through this interview process. Is that good for news or not? I don't know. I would struggle with how to handle that. And so I want to know how you think it should be handled in service of the public being informed.
I can start on that because it has been a big struggle for me. I got my show on CNN right at the beginning of the Trump administration. I started my show in the weekends for CNN in March of 2017. And I, immediately was sort of thrown into the fire. I'd been traveling the country as a correspondent prior to that, covering everything from politics to you name it, I was like the unofficial CNN cannabis correspondent for a long time because I was based in Colorado, the birthplace of recreational marijuana, it seemed, in the country, and, covered all kinds of different stories. So politics wasn't necessarily my thing. It wasn't my forte. I had to quickly develop an acumen for politics in order to be relevant and make sure that we were, covering the most important stories of the day, which a lot of them came out of Washington. And it took some adjustments in terms of preparation for those interviews, and also who I would invite on my show, because it used to be you would invite people, lawmakers on, and you would at least be, starting with a foundation of facts, and you would have an expectation that they weren't just going to come on and speak falsehoods or intentionally lie. And so I think, we had to recalibrate that because quickly it became clear that was happening. And I wanted to make sure that I wasn't then providing an avenue for that misinformation or disinformation, if they're intentionally lying, to be part of, the culture of my show and part of what my viewers were getting, because it isn't valuable to the viewer to confuse them or to, at worst, make them believe the falsehood or allow them to believe the falsehood. And so we had to have internal discussions about, who are we inviting on and what is the value to the viewer? What are we trying to get out of this interview? And sometimes the confrontation wouldn't be the plan, but it became necessary in order to make sure that the facts were put first. And so for me, it was all about preparation and also knowing a little bit more about who it was that was coming on. I mean, I think it's important, again, you have lawmakers who are representing the people. It's important for their constituents and for Americans to hear from those people. But if they come on and they don't have all the facts, maybe they aren't misrepresenting the information intentionally. They just got their source of information was bad. It's to make sure that they're held accountable for that and that they have evidence to back up what they're saying, or that we're able to say, no, these are the facts. This is what we know. So in the case of the 2020 election, for example, interviewing a Republican member of Congress who was newly elected, came on and started talking about, voter fraud, and how it was very sketchy that, certain states didn't start counting those absentee ballots, or that they were still processing all these absentee ballots after election night. And it was incumbent upon me to say that was by design. That was the process that was, developed in Pennsylvania or Michigan or some of these, Rust Belt states in which their Republican controlled state legislatures wouldn't allow those ballots to be processed until close of the polls on election night. And so it was natural for those additional numbers to be counted after election days. In some cases, it was the next day that they started processing in certain counties where they started processing those ballots afterwards. And so it's just really having a grasp of the facts so that when somebody makes an assumption or a claim or an allegation of some sort that is not truthful, that we're able to hold them to account. And I think that's what really is challenging, or was challenging for me, was making sure I had a good grasp of the facts so that I was prepared for any direction an interview could go.
The line drawing is hard. So, it's not like when we talk about these ideas and these principles that, it's obvious in every instance how to make these decisions. Line drawing is hard, but line drawing is necessary. I mean, there's a difference between a bad faith broadcaster of blatant falsehoods and a good faith advocate of a contestable idea. So, if you're going to talk about, say, for example, elections. So if someone is going to say this election was stolen, and they're going to talk about the Kraken, and they're going to talk about sort of all of these various conspiracy theories that have been completely, totally, thoroughly, and utterly debunked, and they somehow get on air, it's very important to confront them directly. Very important. If there's going to be a debate about how much does an ID requirement for voting suppress the vote versus guarantee the integrity of the vote, these are very intensely emotional, contestable ideas, but there are good faith proponents of different forms of ID requirements on both sides of the aisle. And you may have a strong opinion about which one is correct, but there's a big difference between a good faith proponent of a contestable idea, even an idea you might disagree with, and sort of this bad faith broadcaster of the blatant falsehoods. Line drawing is hard sometimes. But one of the other things you have to understand is if somebody is a bad faith, if someone is engaging in bad faith, they often crave the shutdown that you give them on a podcast or on air or whatever, because then you're being silenced. Then it's cancel culture. And so it's a very difficult, even when they get on, and then when you respond aggressively to absolute falsehood, sometimes that's exactly what they want. And so that's why I think one of the really important things is to make sure, as much as you can in good faith, because again, these lines are hard to draw sometimes. In good faith, make sure that you are bringing on programs, bringing on podcasts, interviewing for news stories, all of these things, good faith advocates of contested ideas, as opposed to sort of the bad faith conspiracy theorists. And in the last 4 years, I've seen more of the latter than I'd ever seen before in my professional life, than I'd ever seen before. And I think that's one thing that a lot of Americans who don't pay super close attention to media or don't pay super close attention to the ins and outs of the news cycle just don't really realize. It was an order of magnitude. There was an order of magnitude greater amount of lying, blatant lying, than we'd seen in recent political years.
And so that kind of gets to a question, and again, it's coming up from a couple people in different iterations in the chat, but the kind of fact checking. So Washington Post's fact checker, or PolitiFact's, liar, liar, pants on fire rating, things like that can provide people with verifiable information, can also at the same time, as you mentioned, David, push people a little bit and force them into a more hardened position. For audience members, can force them a little more into their silos rather than opening them up. So again, this is a fine line, but how do we keep nudging people towards more quality information to get them out of their information silos, whichever silo they might be in? And Dan, I think I'm going to throw that to you first, since we haven't heard from you in a while.
I think the role of fact checkers is very important. Glenn Kessler and his team from the Post and the others that do it do a terrific job, and it's a necessary job in this environment. And as David said, it's gotten so much worse over the last 4 years on an exponential level, that it is, it's virtually a round the clock issue. Having said that, I think that that people who don't trust the Washington Post, don't trust mainstream media, look at our fact-checking operation and dismiss it. This in a slightly less polarized environment, there was a Republican political consultant who was working for a campaign whose ads had been called into question in terms of their fact-checking, and his post was, we're not going to run our campaign on the basis of what fact checkers say about what we're doing. And so that can be easily dismissed. And as you suggest, it can create, deeper silos than we're already in. I don't have a good answer on the question of how you regain trust. I think that I think we are in a long period in which there is going to be great mistrust of the press. Now, perhaps under President Biden, things will begin to calm down a bit and we'll see our way through this, but I'm not overly confident that that's going to happen overnight or even in the next few years. I think that it has taken us many years to get to this point of polarization. Trump obviously then just added, so much gasoline to that, that it will be a while before we unwind it. And in the meantime, I think that the best that we can do is to try to do the job that we are paid to do, which is to try to be responsible in our reporting, to be as deep in our reporting, to verify what we do, with the belief that over time, the record that we are compiling will hold up to history's judgment. That the version of events day by day, week by week, month by month, that we are telling will in fact turn out to be the way it is judged as the accurate version. But I don't think that solves the question of trust in media. One of the things we know from public opinion is that with a change of administrations, with a change of parties in power, the views of a variety of things change, whether it is trust in the media, or, for example, the state of the economy. I think Republicans are much gloomier about the state of the economy today than they were before January 20th. And we see that in a variety of ways. I don't think there's anything that the media can do per se to affect that in the short term. And so that's why I say I think we kind of fall back on the values that we think we are trying to uphold, the standards by which we operate, the transparency by which we try to do our jobs, the willingness to admit mistakes, and go from there and believe that in the long run that will win out.
I feel 100% in agreement with the comments we just heard from Dan. I just feel optimistic that if we do what Dan just prescribed there, we will win out, in that we're providing value. We're providing value to the lives of Americans and our international audiences as well. And so, we're not just providing news at CNN to Republicans, or focused on providing news to Democrats, or focused on just independents. We're not focusing on trying to meet a political party's need. It is about meeting the needs of the everyday audience member who is tuning in, and they're tuning in to get news that's going to mean something and have an impact on their lives directly. And so I think when we approach our stories, that is the mindset we have. And I think, there have been signs that method is working when you see subscriptions going up for the New York Times and the Washington Post, and, for CNN to have its most dominant ratings ever since the beginning of this year, in the aftermath of the election, in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. Viewers tuned in to CNN, to these mainstream media sources, because they are credible and because they trust them to bring them the most important information and to cover the story in the greatest way and in most in-depth way possible. And I think it's just continuing to stay true to that and to be dogged about our approach in pursuing that mission. That is making a difference in viewers' lives. That is resulting in, it being a win-win. Media is succeeding, and the audience is succeeding in getting what they are needing from our news coverage.
David?
Yeah, one of the things I think is really important is that those media entities that are they're really there by their mission and by their purpose and by their design, they are not right wing or left wing. That their intention is to be, whether the term is sort of the legacy media, whether the term is objective media or whatever it is, it's not supposed to be partisan media. In other words, it is supposed to be calling balls and strikes as much as possible. One of the things I think is a warning sign for any entity that is in that position is if your staff and key members of your staff tilt overwhelmingly on one side of the political spectrum. Now, does that mean that people who tilt on one side of the political spectrum can't be fair? Of course not. I mean, I tilt on one side of an ideological spectrum and I try my best to be fair. But I think one of the things that ends up happening when you have ideological monocultures in media entities is you often, you don't understand part of your country. You don't understand some of its cultures. We've long understood this, for example, when it comes to racial diversity or ethnic diversity or increasing gender diversity. We've long understood that when you have people from one demographic reporting on people from other demographics, that sometimes you're going to miss something, even if they go into it with the most good faith possible. I remember, when the New York Times after the 2016 election was saying a lot of us don't get religion. They don't get religion because you had a more secular than average media workspace. And so I think that there's a real necessity and a real need. It's not like you sit there and you say, okay, well, America's 33% conservative and 34% independent and the rest a Democrat, and that's what our workforce is going to be like. But I do think there needs to be a real effort to have a diversity of perspectives and a diversity of viewpoints in a newsroom. And I think the lack of that has created and has led to some of the more ugly moments in American media of late, where individuals have been, for example, chased out of newsrooms in very hostile because of very hostile internal reactions to their writing or to their decisions. And I think that things like that undermine trust. Mm-hmm. If you're saying our position, say as the New York Times, is that we want to be not blue news and not red news, but the news. And so I do think that there is something that mainstream media can do to build trust. And that is, it could try to, not perfectly, can never do it perfectly, but try to better reflect the worldviews of the country that they cover.
So that kind of leads to, there's a question that came in from Anna, who's a student at CU Boulder, in the chat. And I'm just going to read it as she wrote it, because I think it's a great question. She writes, I've heard activists say that objectivity can be a privilege or even racist, in that it requires minority journalists to be neutral on their own oppression. For example, a Black reporter being required to include the perspective of police who criticize the premise of Black Lives Matter. The perspective may not be able to be disregarded as objectively untrue, but it can still emotionally alienate the reporter. How do we manage that? What's the right balance for objectivity, even the goal of it or the notion of it within a newsroom, so that people don't get marginalized? I don't know who wants to start off there. It's a big question.
Okay, you want me to? I'll try to take a crack at that.
Thank you.
I think it is a very important question. And it is all the more important for two reasons. One is because of the moment we're in, this moment of racial reckoning that the entire country is in, and because we have more diverse newsrooms than we had in the past, but not as diverse as we need them to be. And there is also a generational aspect of this that we can see in news organizations around the country. There are many more younger people in newsrooms today by the nature of the kinds of work that we do and the hiring practices. And they are the most diverse generation that we've had. And they have perspectives that older, white reporters like myself, don't necessarily have, certainly didn't grow up with. And they are asking questions of this type of newsroom, senior editors. And I think senior editors, I know at our news organization are grappling with this. I had a conversation with a former colleague recently who said, I think we have to figure out how to allow reporters to be citizens first and not subsume their citizenship to being a journalist. That's an issue that sets off debate in newsrooms between people who have what I would call traditional views and people who have views of the moment. And I think that what we hear from Black reporters and other reporters of color is this same kind of question. And I think that the answer is not, I don't think the answer is in black and white, and I don't mean that as a pun. I don't think that the answer is all that simple. But how you balance the traditional role of truth seeking in a nonpartisan way, while also allowing people who have life experiences that are real, allowing them to be able to be fully report in the way that they want to and need to, is the challenge of the moment. And as I say, this is rising in newsrooms all around the country, and probably for the first time, maybe since the civil rights era. But in the civil rights era, newsrooms were almost entirely white and almost entirely white male. And so this debate takes place in a much different environment today.
I have a few thoughts on that as well. As a woman of color, as a mother, as a third generation Mexican immigrant family, I have been part of a lot of these discussions. And I think, I really believe that in order to best serve our viewers, you have to reflect those that are in the audience, both behind the scenes and in front of the camera. And I think, having that diverse perspective that you're bringing collectively to a story or newscast or newspaper report or digital report of some sort, it provides more richness in how you are able to report the story. And in that sense, it's actually getting closer to presenting the whole truth than if you were to exclude some of those viewpoints as part of the story. So as a reporter who's covering an issue that may have a direct impact on me personally, or my community or my household or my grandma or my grandpa or whomever, I have a level of understanding of what some people in this story are going through. That allows me to connect with those people I may be trying to interview. They may open up more, which allows me to help reveal the story that much more. If I'm somebody who's, covering a protest of injustice and inequality, I may have better questions to ask the people who are in authority, because I know what it's like to be on the other side. And so I'm not going to choose to exclude, the police officer who believes that it should be all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter. It's providing an opportunity. I have the opportunity to question that person about why they believe that, and to put other perspectives to challenge them out there. And so I think that is one asset that a diverse, news organization has, is that they're able to cover so much more in a much richer way.
Just quickly on this, I think that there's something that we see often comes up in very particularly hot button issues. Let's take, for example, the police brutality cases. A lot of times you're going to have there might be a narrative that says on a broader, larger scale in this community, police brutality is more likely to be visited upon marginalized communities, African American communities, than it is for other communities like middle class white, upper middle class white. That there is a narrative of factual events that have occurred over the course of many years, that narrative is true. But it can also be the case that the individual incident that you're looking at does not have facts, the closer you look at it, that fit within that sort of broader narrative. And one of the things that I've seen is that often there will be a pressure to minimize, for example, the reporting of facts that go against a narrative, because the broader narrative is seen to be and accurately perceived to be quite important. But if there's one thing we know is there's almost a no better way to sort of blow apart your credibility in everywhere but an activist community if you don't report facts, even when those facts are contrary to narrative, to a larger narrative, even if that larger narrative is true. And so what you'll often see is a circumstance, let's say a police shooting, that on first blush appears to fit within prior patterns. And if the reporting later on that it doesn't fit within the prior patterns isn't as prominent, or maybe is more is minimized by comparison to the initial reports, that's a serious problem. And the task is then to say, so for example, I'm an opinion journalist. I have ideas. There is something, for example, I would like to see as a matter of reform. Qualified immunity is this legal doctrine that allows agents of the state to not pay compensation to victims, even when they violate the civil rights of victims. And it's a judicially created doctrine that actually contradicts the Civil Rights Act, that the relevant Civil Rights Act that gives victims a right to compensation. So I can, at the same time, say, I think qualified immunity should be eradicated and it's a matter of justice. But at the same time, I can also then say this case or that case is not a case against qualified immunity. That case has different facts. And so I think it's very important to be able to put things in context and to not subordinate the facts of an individual instance to a larger narrative, however you might feel like that larger narrative leads to justice.
Thank you. I just wanted to give each of you kind of a 1-minute wrap up if there's something you want to close on, because we're almost at time, and I think we'll go in reverse alphabetical order. So David, I'm actually going to start with you. Any kind of closing thoughts for our group?
Yeah, so I'm kind of coming at this from a position, as I said earlier, of being an opinion journalist. And a couple of things I think that are particularly incumbent upon those of us who want to be trusted when the public knows we have a point of view. And I can think a few things more important if you're someone coming from a point of view where someone's going to trust you is can you see clearly, to use sort of a biblical analogy, the logs or the specks in your own eye, in your own team? Or are you constantly a lawyer for the people in the red jersey or the blue jersey? If you're constantly a lawyer for someone on your team, then I think fairly enough people can discount what you say. But if you're fair enough to be able to turn around and look with a critical eye against the people who sort of wear your own ideological jersey, then I think in many cases, some of those individuals can be among the most trusted and valuable voices in our political and cultural debate.
Thank you. Hannah.
I will say thank you to all of our participants here in this discussion, because I've learned so much from both of you gentlemen, Dan and David. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with all of us. I think for me, being a journalist is about asking good questions. That's one thing I was taught when I was a kid, going to class every day. My dad would always, leave on his closing thought of ask good questions. I think we all can continue to do that in our lives, whether you're a journalist or everyday citizen. And that's going to help also get us through this moment in which there's distrust in the media. And that is, seeking the facts in your own lives, vetting information and your sources of information, and not just being quick to accept something that fits your viewpoint or opinion, but really seeking the truth and challenging yourself to consider other ideas and opinions and other news sources. Don't just go to one news source, even if it is a credible news source, you are certain of it. Make sure you explore, because you might just stumble upon a revelation that you hadn't expected. And I think, that's one of the aspects about my job that I love, is that I'm always learning. I kind of always feel like a student. There's always something more to learn. And we don't have all the answers as journalists. We just don't. And so I think, as our audiences are leaving this discussion, just know that, we are doing the best we can, and we're human too. And there's always room for improvement and room to learn a lot more.
Great. Thank you very much. Dan.
I would echo Anna in thanking you all for letting me be part of this. This has really been a really interesting discussion on some very important issues. I'll leave with 2 points. One is, I think the role of the press has never been more important. And as that is the case, I think that it carries with it greater responsibilities than we've had in the past. I think people somehow took for granted for many years the role of an independent and free press and the importance of the First Amendment. And now that it is recognized, I think that we owe it to everybody who comes to our website, reads our print edition, the best that we can possibly do to live up to what that requires. I think the second, in a more personal way, is that one of the challenges of being a reporter is to challenge your own assumptions and to recognize when it hits you in the face or before it hits you in the face, that in one way or another, you don't understand something that you thought you might understand. I think many of us came out of the 2016 election with that in mind. I don't know that we've particularly solved it. I don't know that I've particularly solved it, since I've been sitting in my house for the last year and I can't get out and talk to people in the way I've traditionally done as a political reporter. But I think that we all are living in different bubbles, and breaking out of those bubbles is important. And I think that's one of the challenges that we all should take individually. And if we do that, then institutionally, I think we'll be better off.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank everybody who logged in today for this panel, for joining us and making the time for this. I think it has been, for me, a fascinating discussion, and I'm grateful to all of our panelists, Dan Balz, Anna Cabrera, David French, who volunteered their time to be with us today. Many thanks to you. For those of you in the audience, if you would like to support them, learn more about their work, you can find their books, their podcasts, their social media accounts linked to on the Conference on World Affairs website. The Conference on World Affairs does rely on the generosity of people like you who make this event possible, so please consider making a gift to the CWA, which can be done on the CWA website at www.colorado.edu/CWA. Also, please tune in through the rest of the week, through Sunday, April 11th, for live CWA events, or to catch up on those that you might have missed during this week on the CWA YouTube channel. Again, thank you everybody for joining us, and thanks very much to our panelists. It was wonderful.